The rain drummed against the corrugated roof of Monroe's auto repair as Caleb wiped grease from his hands, preparing to lock up for the evening. At 39, he moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to value every minute, every dollar. Through the grimy window, he spotted a figure stumbling across the empty parking lot, a man in leather, blood seeping through his jacket, dragging a damaged motorcycle behind him. The stranger's face was etched with pain and exhaustion, his arms covered in faded tattoos that told stories Caleb couldn't read. Without hesitation, Caleb unlocked the door and helped the wounded biker inside, ignoring the disapproving stares from neighbors who had already begun to whisper. The morning brought consequences Caleb hadn't anticipated. He was fired. His boss, Earl Patterson, stood in the doorway of the garage with arms crossed and a face carved from stone. Word had traveled fast in their small town. Someone had seen the motorcycle, recognized the colors, made assumptions that spread like wildfire through Cedar Falls' tight-knit community. Earl's voice was flat and final as he delivered the news that would change everything. Caleb Monroe, reliable mechanic and single father, was no longer welcome at Monroe's auto repair. The irony wasn't lost on Caleb that he was being fired from a business that bore his family name, a place where he had worked faithfully for 7 years since returning from overseas. The discharge papers felt like a death sentence in his weathered hands. Within hours, the whispers had transformed into a wildfire of speculation that consumed the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. Mothers pulled their children closer when they saw Caleb at the grocery store, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disgust that cut deeper than any physical wound. The pharmacist, who had known Caleb since high school and had once trusted him with credit during lean months, suddenly became formal and distant when he came to pick up Maisie's asthma medication. Phone calls from potential employers went unreturned after his name was mentioned in hushed conversations. Job interviews that had been scheduled were canceled without explanation, leaving voicemails that spoke of unforeseen circumstances and changing requirements. The mechanic who had once been trusted with the town's most precious possessions, their vehicles, their safety, their family transportation, was now treated like a dangerous criminal who might contaminate everything he touched. Hardware store clerks followed him through aisles as if expecting him to steal. Bank tellers processed his transactions with nervous efficiency, their smiles strained and artificial. Even the coffee shop, where he had been a regular customer for years, became a hostile environment where conversations stopped when he entered and resumed in whispers after he left. The isolation was suffocating, pressing down on him like a physical weight that grew heavier with each passing day. At Maisie's elementary school, the transformation was even more heartbreaking to witness. Parents who had once exchanged pleasant small talk during pickup time now avoided eye contact entirely, shepherding their children away as if Caleb carried some contagious moral disease. Birthday party invitations that had once filled their mailbox disappeared completely, leaving Maisie to wonder why her friends no longer wanted her around. Playdates were canceled with flimsy excuses about busy schedules and family commitments. The 8-year-old girl who had once been popular among her classmates now sat alone at lunch, her bright spirit dimming with each passing day as she absorbed the unspoken message that her father had somehow become someone to fear. Maisie's teacher, Mrs. Henderson, began speaking to Caleb in hushed, apologetic tones, as if she were delivering news of a terminal diagnosis rather than discussing his daughter's progress in mathematics. The woman who had once praised Maisie's creativity and intelligence now seemed uncomfortable in Caleb's presence, her body language suggesting she wished their conferences could be conducted over the phone. Other parents gathered in small groups near the school entrance, their conversations falling silent whenever Caleb approached to collect his daughter. The weight of their judgment was crushing, but Caleb endured it for Maisie's sake, maintaining his composure even as his heart broke watching his daughter's confusion and growing sadness. The social isolation extended beyond the school grounds into every aspect of their daily lives. The local diner where Caleb had once enjoyed Sunday breakfast with Maisie now served them with obvious reluctance, seating them in the back corner away from other families. Church services became exercises in endurance as fellow parishioners shifted uncomfortably in their pews, avoiding the handshake of peace that had once been offered freely. Even the mailman began leaving packages on the porch instead of knocking, as if personal interaction might somehow implicate him in whatever crimes Caleb was presumed to have committed. Simple errands became ordeals that required emotional preparation and recovery time, each venture into public a reminder of how completely his reputation had been destroyed by a single act of compassion. Caleb found himself taking on whatever work he could find, cleaning bathrooms at the truck stop on Highway 12, hauling trash for elderly neighbors who still remembered him as the polite young man who had served his country with distinction. The pay was sporadic and insufficient, barely covering the rent on their small two-bedroom house, let alone Maisie's medical expenses that seemed to increase with each passing month. Each evening, he would sit at their kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, trying to perform mathematical miracles that would stretch $20 into $50, praying that his daughter's inhaler wouldn't run out before he could afford to refill the prescription. The weight of constant rejection began to erode Caleb's self-confidence in ways he hadn't expected. He found himself questioning decisions that had once come naturally, second-guessing every interaction with neighbors and strangers alike. The man who had once moved through the world with quiet confidence now felt like an imposter in his own life, constantly aware of the suspicious glances and whispered conversations that followed in his wake. The stress manifested in physical symptoms, sleepless nights, loss of appetite, a persistent tension in his shoulders that no amount of stretching could relieve. He began to understand how social ostracism could break a person's spirit more effectively than any physical punishment. The nights brought their own particular brand of torture. Caleb would lie in his narrow bed, listening to the sound of Maisie's labored breathing through the thin walls of their house, counting the wheeze in each exhale and calculating how many doses of medication remained in her inhaler. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by nightmares that blended memories of war with fears of his daughter's suffering. He would wake in cold sweats, check on Maisie, then sit in his kitchen drinking instant coffee and staring at the stack of unpaid bills that seemed to multiply in the darkness like malevolent organisms feeding on his despair. The silence of those sleepless hours was broken only by the distant sound of motorcycles on the highway, a reminder of the moment that had changed everything, the single act of compassion that had somehow transformed him from respected community member to social pariah. He would replay that rainy evening over and over, wondering if he should have made a different choice, if protecting his daughter's future should have taken precedence over helping a stranger. But even in his darkest moments, Caleb couldn't bring himself to regret his decision to help someone in need. Sarah had taught him that character was defined by what you did when no one was watching, when there was no reward expected or received. During one particularly difficult night, as rain pelted against the windows and Maisie's cough echoed through the house like a physical manifestation of his failures as a provider, Caleb found himself remembering Sarah's final words in the hospital. His wife had made him promise to stay kind, to keep helping people even when the world seemed determined to break his spirit. She had believed that goodness was a choice that had to be made again and again, especially when it felt impossible or unrewarded. Her faith had been absolute, unshakable even in the face of her own mortality, and she had passed that conviction to him like a sacred trust that he was honor-bound to preserve. The memories came in waves during those sleepless nights, carrying him back to the day Sarah died in the twisted wreckage of their sedan, victim to a drunk driver who walked away without a scratch while she bled out on the asphalt of Interstate 40. Caleb had been deployed when it happened, had to beg for emergency leave to come home and bury his wife while learning to be a single father to a traumatized 4-year-old who kept asking when mommy was coming home. The army chaplain had told him that God had a plan, that everything happened for a reason, but Caleb had stopped believing in divine providence the moment he saw Sarah's empty hospital bed. What he hadn't stopped believing in was the idea that small acts of kindness could create ripples of change in an otherwise indifferent universe. Sarah had lived that philosophy every day, bringing soup to sick neighbors, volunteering at the animal shelter, listening with genuine interest to the problems of checkout clerks and waitresses who were usually invisible to other customers. She had possessed an almost supernatural ability to make people feel seen and valued, a gift that had drawn Caleb to her like a moth to flame during their college years. It had been the kindness of strangers, the neighbor who mowed his lawn without being asked, the teacher who stayed late to help Maisie with her reading, the mechanic who gave him a job when his military experience seemed irrelevant to everyone else, that had kept him anchored to hope during those dark early months of widowhood. The morning arrived gray and unremarkable, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into everything and settle in the bones like a low-grade fever. Caleb was heating a can of soup for breakfast, stretching their meager grocery budget by making meals that could serve double duty as lunch, when he noticed something unusual on his front porch, a dented metal box that hadn't been there the night before. The box looked old, weathered by years of use and neglect, its surface marked by scratches and rust stains that spoke of a hard life in unforgiving environments. Inside, wrapped in a piece of old cloth that might once have been a bandana, he found a faded photograph of a young boy with serious eyes and an expression of innocent hope that seemed heartbreakingly familiar. The child in the picture couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, his smile bright and unguarded, his clothes neat and carefully maintained by someone who loved him. Beneath the photograph was a letter written in careful handwriting, each word formed with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned that communication was too important to be rushed or careless. The words were simple, but carried the weight of years of pain and gratitude that had been accumulating like interest in an emotional account that could never be fully settled. The writer thanked him for seeing a human being instead of a stereotype, for offering help without asking questions that might have revealed uncomfortable truths, for treating him with dignity when the rest of the world had written him off as worthless and irredeemable. The letter spoke of transformation, of a moment of grace that had reminded its author that redemption was possible even for those who had traveled too far down dark roads. The letter explained that the writer had been estranged from his family for over a decade, living on the edges of society and convinced that he was beyond redemption or forgiveness. He had built walls around his heart so high and thick that he had forgotten what it felt like to trust another person's motives or accept kindness without suspicion. But something about Caleb's simple act of compassion had sparked a memory of who he used to be, before anger and disappointment had hardened his heart into something that felt more like scar tissue than living flesh. For the first time in years, he had called his father, had taken the first tentative steps toward reconciliation and healing that felt both terrifying and necessary. The conversation had been awkward, punctuated by long silences and careful words, but it had been a beginning rather than another ending. The letter was signed simply E, no last name, no return address, just a single initial from someone whose life had been touched by an act of grace that he would never forget and could never adequately repay. Caleb read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling slightly as the words sank in and began to reshape his understanding of that rainy night. He thought about all the assumptions he had made about the injured biker, how easy it would have been to turn away and lock the door, to choose safety over compassion and justify it with reasonable concerns about his daughter's welfare. The photograph showed a child who could have been any child, innocent, hopeful, full of potential that life had not yet had the opportunity to crush or redirect. The sound began as a distant rumble, barely audible over the evening traffic on Cedar Falls Main Street, a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself before resolving into something more mechanical and purposeful. Caleb was helping Maisie with her homework when the noise grew louder, more insistent, until it became impossible to ignore or dismiss as routine highway traffic. He moved to the window and felt his blood turn to ice as the full scope of what was happening became clear. 40 motorcycles were arranged in perfect formation outside his house, their chrome gleaming under the streetlights like weapons prepared for battle, their engines creating a symphony of barely contained power that made the windows vibrate in their frames. The riders sat motionless on their bikes, faces hidden behind dark helmets that reflected the streetlights like the visors of ancient warriors. They waited with the patience of soldiers before a battle, their formations so precise it seemed choreographed, their collective presence radiating an authority that transformed the quiet residential street into something resembling a military staging area. Neighbors began appearing in doorways and behind curtains, drawn by the unprecedented sound and spectacle of so many motorcycles gathered in one place. The air itself seemed to thrum with potential energy, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something momentous to happen. Caleb's instinct was to protect his daughter, to gather her in his arms and retreat to the back of the house where they might be safe from whatever was about to unfold. His military training kicked in automatically, assessing escape routes and defensive positions, calculating the odds of reaching Maisie's bedroom before whatever was about to happen actually happened. But something in their stillness, their organized precision, suggested this wasn't a random act of violence or intimidation. There was ceremony in their arrangement, respect in their patient waiting, purpose in their collective presence that transcended mere threat or display of force. As he watched, 2 figures dismounted from their bikes and began walking toward his front door with the measured pace of men who were accustomed to being watched and evaluated. The first was familiar, the injured biker he had helped, now walking without the limp that had marked him that rainy night. His posture straight and confident, his bearing transformed by what appeared to be a profound internal change. The second was an older man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, his presence filling the space around him with an authority that was felt rather than seen. Maisie pressed against her father's side, her small body trembling with fear as the doorbell rang with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the neighborhood. Caleb had faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, had made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for his fellow soldiers, had survived mortar attacks that had left him temporarily deaf and permanently changed. But nothing had prepared him for the surreal experience of opening his front door to find members of one of America's most notorious motorcycle clubs standing on his porch like door-to-door salesmen with a very different kind of product to offer. The older man stepped forward, removing his helmet to reveal weathered features and eyes that held decades of hard-earned wisdom, scars both visible and hidden, stories that could fill libraries if they were ever fully told. When he spoke, his voice was gravelly but respectful, carrying an authority that commanded attention without raising its volume, that made people listen, not through fear but through recognition of genuine power tempered by discipline and purpose. His words were carefully chosen, laden with the weight of a parent's gratitude and a leader's respect, spoken with the formality of someone who understood that some moments required ceremony to be properly honored. The man introduced himself as Jack Quinn, explaining that he was the father of the young man Caleb had helped, that he had come to express gratitude that could not be adequately conveyed through letters or intermediaries but required face-to-face acknowledgement between men who understood the true cost of honor and compassion. His words were delivered without theatricality or artificial emotion, simply as facts that needed to be stated clearly and completely. He spoke of sons who had lost their way, of second chances that came disguised as random encounters, of the rare individuals who still believed in helping strangers, without expecting anything in return beyond the satisfaction of doing what was right. Jack's presence filled the doorway, but there was nothing threatening in his demeanor, only the profound dignity of a man acknowledging a debt that could never be fully repaid, a father recognizing another father's goodness, a leader honoring the kind of character that made civilization possible. Behind him, the other bikers remained seated on their motorcycles, their engines idling quietly now, their collective presence serving as both honor guard and witness to what was taking place on Caleb's front porch. The scene had the quality of ritual, of something sacred being acknowledged in the most unlikely of circumstances. Behind Jack, his son Elliot stepped into the light, his face no longer masked by pain and exhaustion, but instead revealing features that looked younger than Caleb remembered, vulnerability replacing the hard edges that had defined him during their first encounter. The transformation was remarkable. Where once there had been desperation and barely controlled violence, now there was something approaching peace, a sense of having found his way back to himself after years of wandering in wilderness, both literal and metaphorical. His eyes held gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness, the kind of emotion that comes only from having been pulled back from the brink of complete despair. Elliot spoke haltingly about the years he had spent running from his family, from responsibility, from the possibility of redemption that had seemed like a cruel joke played by a universe that had already demonstrated its indifference to his suffering. He had been on his way to nowhere that rainy night, convinced that he had burned too many bridges to ever find his way home, that his mistakes had accumulated beyond the possibility of forgiveness or repair. But something about Caleb's simple kindness had reminded him that grace was possible, that people could still surprise you with their capacity for goodness, that healing was a choice rather than a destination. The conversation that followed took place on Caleb's front porch while 40 bikers waited in respectful silence, their presence transforming the suburban street into something resembling a sacred space where important business was being conducted according to protocols that predated modern society. Jack spoke of his own failures as a father, of the mistakes that had driven his son away, of decisions made in anger that had created wounds too deep for normal conversation to heal. He had built an empire of loyalty and respect within the motorcycle club, had commanded men who would follow him into any danger without question, but had failed at the most important job of his life, being a father to a boy who needed guidance more than discipline. The admission came without self-pity or excuses, delivered with the stark honesty of a man who had learned that survival sometimes required brutal self-assessment. Jack had spent decades building walls around his emotions, teaching himself to lead through strength and intimidation, to solve problems through force and determination. But those same qualities that had made him effective in his chosen world had made him ineffective as a parent, unable to reach a son who needed love more than lessons, acceptance more than achievement. When Elliot had finally called him after 12 years of silence, Jack had felt something he thought was lost forever: hope for reconciliation and healing, the possibility that time had not completely erased the bond between father and son. Caleb found himself sharing his own story, talking about Sarah's death and the challenges of single parenthood, about the promise he had made to stay kind even when kindness felt like weakness or stupidity. He spoke of sleepless nights and unpaid bills, of watching his daughter struggle with asthma while he struggled to afford her medication, of the weight of being both mother and father to a child who deserved better than what circumstances had provided. The two fathers discovered common ground in their shared struggles, in their determination to be better than their circumstances suggested they could be, in their recognition that children deserved parents who would fight for them even when the odds seemed impossible. Jack spoke with the authority of someone who had commanded respect through strength, but who had learned that true power came from admitting mistakes and working to correct them rather than simply avoiding their consequences. Their conversations stretched into the night, punctuated by the distant sound of motorcycle engines idling patiently in the street, witnessed by men who understood that some conversations were more important than schedules or convenience, that healing required time and space, and the kind of honest communication that was becoming increasingly rare in a world that valued speed over depth. As dawn approached, Jack made an offer that would change everything, speaking with the directness of a man who had learned that complicated problems sometimes required simple solutions implemented with unwavering commitment. The bikers had resources, connections, the ability to make things happen quickly and efficiently without getting tangled in bureaucratic red tape or social prejudices. They wanted to help Caleb rebuild his life, not as charity, but as repayment for a debt that went beyond money or material possessions, as recognition of character that deserved support rather than persecution. Jack understood that Caleb's reputation in Cedar Falls had been destroyed by rumors and assumptions, that his ability to provide for his daughter had been compromised by small-town gossip, and the kind of prejudice that destroyed lives without offering opportunities for defense or explanation. But he also knew that actions spoke louder than words, that respect could be rebuilt through demonstration rather than argument, that the right kind of support could transform a victim into a success story that would silence critics more effectively than any verbal defense. They would help him open a new garage, one that bore his own name and reflected his values rather than the prejudices of small-town gossip, a business that could serve as both livelihood and statement of principle. Caleb's initial instinct was to refuse, to maintain his independence despite the cost, to prove that he could rebuild his life through his own efforts and determination. Pride was a luxury he had cultivated during his military service, a belief that accepting help was a sign of weakness rather than wisdom. But as he looked at his daughter sleeping peacefully in her bedroom, unaware of the extraordinary gathering taking place outside her home, he realized that pride was indeed a luxury he could no longer afford. Maisie needed stability, medical care, a future that wasn't defined by her father's stubbornness or his need to prove himself to people who had already made up their minds about his character. The transformation began immediately, with the kind of efficiency that only came from years of working together toward common goals. Within days, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town had been purchased through channels that bypassed the usual complications of financing and inspection, bureaucratic obstacles that might have delayed or prevented a normal business startup. The building was solid but neglected, requiring the kind of comprehensive renovation that would have been prohibitively expensive under normal circumstances, but became manageable when undertaken by skilled volunteers who were motivated by loyalty rather than profit. The bikers worked with the precision of a military unit, each man contributing his particular skills to the renovation project that transformed the empty space into something approaching a cathedral of automotive repair. Some were electricians who had learned their trade in legitimate jobs before finding their way into the motorcycle club. Others were welders or carpenters, plumbers or painters, all of them united by a shared commitment to repaying Caleb's kindness through the kind of hard physical labor that created value through sweat and determination rather than luck or inheritance. They worked without complaint, arriving early and staying late, transforming the empty warehouse into a state-of-the-art automotive repair facility that would have been the envy of established businesses with decades of accumulated capital and equipment. Maisie became the unofficial mascot of the construction project, her laughter echoing through the warehouse as she helped with small tasks and charmed the tough bikers with her innocence and enthusiasm. The men who had spent years cultivating images of intimidation and danger found themselves competing for the attention of an 8-year-old girl who saw them simply as her father's friends, people who were helping to build something wonderful that would secure her future and restore her family's place in the community. She painted a sign for the office wall, her childish handwriting spelling out Iron and Grace in bright blue letters that seemed to glow against the freshly painted white background. The name had come to her spontaneously, she explained to her father, because the garage was full of iron things and graceful people who were helping them start over. The bikers adopted the name immediately, finding poetry in its simplicity and truth in its message, recognition that strength and beauty could coexist in the same space. That power was most impressive when tempered by compassion and purpose. Iron and Grace became more than just a business name. By RA, it became a philosophy, a way of approaching the world that honored both the toughness required to survive difficult circumstances and the grace required to help others do the same. As word spread about the new garage, Caleb discovered that his reputation was being rebuilt one satisfied customer at a time through the kind of organic marketing that money couldn't buy and critics found difficult to argue against. The bikers brought their friends, who brought their neighbors, who brought their coworkers, creating a customer base that valued honesty and competence over social status and conventional appearances. Unlike his previous job, where he had been just another employee subject to the whims and prejudices of an owner who valued conformity over character, Iron and Grace belonged to him completely. He could set his own standards, choose his own clients, create the kind of workplace where character mattered more than appearances, where people were judged by their actions rather than their associations or their ability to fit into predetermined social categories. The garage quickly developed a reputation for honest work at fair prices, staffed by a man who treated every customer with dignity regardless of their background or circumstances. Word of mouth spread through networks of trust and friendship that transcended traditional social boundaries, bringing customers who had been burned by dishonest mechanics and were looking for someone they could trust with their most important possessions. The clientele that gravitated toward Iron and Grace reflected Caleb's own journey from judgment to acceptance, from the comfortable certainties of prejudice to the more challenging but ultimately more rewarding practice of evaluating people as individuals rather than representatives of groups. Veterans struggling with civilian life found understanding in his patient explanations of automotive repairs, recognition in his eyes of battles they had fought and scars they carried, both visible and hidden. Former addicts working to rebuild their lives discovered employment opportunities and second chances that were rare in a world that preferred to write people off rather than write them back into the story of redemption and hope. Single mothers stretching tight budgets received honest assessments and payment plans that acknowledged their financial realities without condescension or judgment, respect that recognized their struggles without defining them by their limitations. Elderly customers on fixed incomes found that Caleb's prices reflected their circumstances rather than market rates that assumed everyone had unlimited resources. The garage became more than a business. It evolved into a community center where people who had been written off by society could find acceptance and hope, practical help and emotional support that extended far beyond automotive repair. Caleb instituted a policy that surprised many of his customers but perfectly reflected the values that had guided his decision to help a stranger on that rainy night. He would teach basic automotive maintenance to anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of age or background or ability to pay for formal instruction. Teenagers from troubled homes learned to change oil and rotate tires, gaining confidence along with mechanical skills, discovering that they were capable of learning and creating value through their own efforts. The knowledge they gained saved them money in the short term and provided potential career paths for the future, opening doors that had previously seemed permanently closed. Elderly customers discovered they could perform simple maintenance tasks themselves, saving money while maintaining their independence and dignity in a world that often seemed designed to make them feel helpless and dependent. Women who had been taught that automotive repair was beyond their capabilities found that patient instruction and encouragement could overcome decades of cultural conditioning that had limited their sense of what was possible. Maisie became his assistant instructor, her natural empathy helping nervous students feel comfortable asking questions and making mistakes, her presence serving as a reminder that learning was a lifelong process that should be marked by curiosity rather than fear. The success of Iron and Grace created ripple effects throughout Cedar Falls that no one had anticipated, transforming not just individual lives but the character of the entire community in ways that were subtle but profound. Other business owners began to reconsider their assumptions about the motorcycle club members who had become regular fixtures in town, their behavior challenging stereotypes through demonstration rather than argument. The bikers, many of whom had college degrees and professional backgrounds that had been overshadowed by their choice to ride motorcycles and wear leather jackets, challenged preconceptions through their actions rather than their words. They volunteered for community service projects that had previously struggled to find participants, donated to local charities that served children and veterans, and demonstrated that loyalty and brotherhood could be forces for positive change rather than intimidation and violence. Their presence in town became less threatening and more reassuring as people observed their behavior over time, their commitment to helping rather than harming, their respect for law and order that had been hidden beneath surface appearances that had triggered fear rather than recognition. The transformation was gradual but undeniable, changing hearts and minds through patient demonstration rather than argument or confrontation. Mrs. Henderson, Maisie's teacher, was among the first to apologize for her previous treatment of the Monroe family, her words carrying the weight of genuine regret and the promise of changed behavior in the future. She had watched Maisie blossom from a withdrawn, worried child into a confident young girl who spoke enthusiastically about her father's work and her new extended family of honorary uncles, who taught her about motorcycles and tools and the satisfaction that came from building something useful with your own hands. The teacher recognized that her assumptions had been based on fear rather than facts, prejudice rather than experience, the kind of lazy thinking that was easier than the challenging work of evaluating individuals on their own merits. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by regular mail in an envelope with no return address, the kind of mystery that would once have caused anxiety but now seemed like a promise of good news or at least interesting developments. Caleb recognized the careful handwriting immediately. It was the same script that had thanked him for his kindness months earlier, the same deliberate precision that spoke of someone who had learned that communication was too important to be rushed or careless, that some messages deserved the time and attention required to get them exactly right. But this letter was different, longer, and more detailed, filled with information that had taken months to verify and courage to share. It was signed with a full name rather than just an initial, Jack Quinn's signature bold and confident at the bottom of several pages that would transform Caleb's understanding of the connections that bound their lives together in ways that neither man had realized when they first met on. That front porch surrounded by 40 motorcycles and witnessed by an entire neighborhood. The revelation contained within those carefully written pages would challenge everything Caleb thought he understood about coincidence and destiny. The letter described a day in Afghanistan 12 years earlier, when Sergeant Jack Quinn of the Army Corps of Engineers had pulled an injured medic from the wreckage of an overturned Humvee, following an improvised explosive device attack that had left 3 soldiers dead and several others wounded. The medic had been unconscious, his dog tags the only identification in the chaos that followed such attacks, his survival uncertain, but his need for immediate medical attention obvious to anyone with combat experience and basic human compassion. Jack had carried the wounded soldier to safety, staying with him until the medevac helicopter arrived, never learning his name or his fate, filing the incident away as one of hundreds of similar moments during his deployment. It wasn't until Elliot had described Caleb's military bearing and medical skills, his automatic response to injury and crisis, his ability to remain calm under pressure, that Jack had begun to suspect a connection that seemed too improbable to be coincidence. A few discreet inquiries through veteran networks that operated outside official channels had confirmed what Jack had begun to hope. The man who had saved his son was the same medic he had rescued years earlier in a war zone half a world away. The same person whose life he had preserved without knowing that they were destined to meet again under circumstances that would test both their character and their commitment to the values they had served. Caleb read the letter 3 times before its full implications sank in, each reading revealing new layers of meaning and connection that had been invisible during their first meeting. but which now seemed to explain the immediate sense of recognition and trust that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. He remembered that day in Afghanistan with painful clarity, the explosion, the twisted metal, the moment of consciousness when he realized he was trapped and likely to die, the sensation of strong hands pulling him free and a voice telling him he was going to be okay when everything around him suggested otherwise. But he had no memory of his rescuer's face, only the sensation of being lifted and carried, of professional competence and personal courage working together to save a life that might otherwise have been lost to confusion and panic. The knowledge that Jack Quinn had saved his life added another layer of meaning to their relationship, transforming gratitude into something deeper and more profound, recognition that their bond had been forged in fire and tested by time before either of them understood its true nature. The circle of connection extended beyond the two fathers to encompass their children as well, creating patterns of redemption and healing that seemed to operate according to laws more complex than simple cause and effect. Elliot had found his way back to his family through Caleb's kindness, while Maisie had gained a community of protectors who would ensure her safety and success. The garage had become a symbol of second chances and new beginnings, proof that people could overcome their past mistakes and create something beautiful from the wreckage of broken dreams and shattered expectations. Iron and Grace stood as a testament to the idea that grace could be found in the most unexpected places, offered by the most unlikely people, received by those who had learned to recognize its value, regardless of its source or the circumstances that had made it necessary. The business thrived not just because of its honest practices and fair prices, but because it represented something larger, the possibility of redemption, the power of community, the truth that kindness was never wasted, even when its effects weren't immediately visible. On a warm evening in late spring, as the last traces of winter finally surrendered to the promise of renewal that marked the changing seasons in their small corner of the world, Caleb stood in the doorway of his garage watching Maisie help one of the younger bikers learn to use a socket wrench. The child who had once been isolated and afraid, who had sat alone at lunch tables and wondered why her friends had abandoned her, was now confident and surrounded by love from sources her father could never have imagined when he first opened his door to a wounded stranger on that rainy night that had changed everything. The bikers who had once been viewed with suspicion and fear were now integral members of the community, their loyalty and dedication evident in everything they did, from volunteering at school fundraisers to helping elderly neighbors with yard work that had become too difficult for aging bodies to manage alone. The transformation had been gradual but complete, changing not just individual lives but the character of the entire town, proving that prejudice was a choice rather than an inevitable response to difference, that understanding could replace fear when people were willing to look beyond surface appearances to recognize shared humanity. As the sun set behind the mountains that surrounded Cedar Falls, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reflected off the chrome and steel of the motorcycles parked outside Iron and Grace, Caleb reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment of contentment and purpose. He thought about Sarah's final words, her insistence that kindness was always the right choice, even when its benefits weren't immediately apparent, even when it seemed to create more problems than it solved. Her faith had been vindicated in ways that neither of them could have imagined during those final conversations in the hospital, her belief in the power of grace to transform lives proven through the most unlikely circumstances and unexpected allies. He thought about the wounded biker he had helped on that rainy night, never imagining that his simple act of compassion would create a family he had never expected and a future he could never have planned. The decision to open his door and offer help to a stranger had seemed like the most natural thing in the world at the time, guided by values that Sarah had helped him understand and military service had reinforced. But the consequences had been far more complex and ultimately more rewarding than any simple good deed had a right to expect. The garage buzzed with activity around him, filled with the sound of laughter and the smell of motor oil, alive with the energy of people who had found their place in the world through the simple act of being accepted for who they were rather than judged for who they had been. Iron and Grace had become more than a business. It was a testament to the idea that grace could be found in the most unexpected places, that redemption was always possible for those willing to do the work required to earn it, that kindness was not weakness, but the strongest force in the universe when properly applied and consistently practiced. Maisie ran up to him, her face glowing with excitement as she showed him a small wrench that one of the bikers had given her, her own tool to use when helping with simple repairs and maintenance tasks. Her recovery from the shy, worried child she had been during their darkest months was complete, her confidence restored along with her father's reputation and their family's place in the community. She talked enthusiastically about school projects and friends' birthday parties, about the motorcycle rides Jack had promised her when she was old enough, about the college fund that had been quietly established to ensure her future education regardless of what challenges life might bring. The lessons Caleb had learned during his darkest months had not been forgotten, even as his circumstances improved dramatically. He continued to help people who found themselves in situations similar to what he had experienced, offering employment to those who had been written off by other employers, providing references for people who were trying to rebuild their lives after making mistakes that had cost them their reputations. The garage had become known throughout the region as a place where second chances were not just possible but expected, where people were judged by their current actions rather than their past failures. Jack Quinn had become more than a business partner or grateful father. He had evolved into something approaching a mentor and friend, someone whose experience and wisdom complemented Caleb's technical skills and natural empathy. Their conversations during quiet moments at the garage ranged from practical business matters to deeper philosophical questions about redemption, responsibility, and the ways that seemingly random encounters could reshape entire lives. Both men had learned that leadership was less about commanding respect than earning it through consistent actions that reflected clearly defined values. The relationship between Caleb and Elliot had also deepened over the months, evolving from gratitude and obligation into genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to start over after making mistakes that had seemed unforgivable. Elliot had taken on increasing responsibility at the garage, his mechanical skills complementing his father's business acumen and Caleb's reputation for integrity. The young man who had once been convinced he was beyond redemption had become living proof that people could change when given the right combination of opportunity and support. As the evening settled around them and the last customers departed for home, Caleb locked the doors of Iron and Grace and walked with his daughter toward their truck, surrounded by the family of choice that had emerged from the ashes of judgment and prejudice. The bikers who remained called out their goodnights, their voices carrying the warmth of genuine affection and the satisfaction of work well done, relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation or fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, more chances to prove that character was defined by choices rather than circumstances. The circle that had begun with one man's decision to help a stranger in need had expanded to encompass an entire community, proving that kindness was indeed contagious when properly applied, that grace had the power to transform not just individual lives but entire communities, when people were willing to look beyond surface appearances, to recognize the humanity that connected them all. Iron and Grace stood as proof that second chances were not just possible but necessary, that healing could happen when people were willing to see past their fears, to recognize the potential for good that existed in even the most unlikely circumstances and unexpected people.